I told you my story, you would hear hope that wouldn't let go. And if I told you my story, you would hear love that never gave up.
Well, I guess my story begins when I was born. I was born into a multi-generational family. It was my mother and father and my maternal grandparents. After I turned 5, at some point, I don't remember the exact date, my father started molesting me. And that continued through the years until I was 14. Fortunately for me, my father was a wanderer, so he wasn't at home all the time. So there would be periods of months where he was gone and life was better for me. Obviously, my mother and grandparents had no idea what was going on. I guess I was about 8 or 9, and my grandmother decided that she was going to go back to church and invited me to go along with her. My father told me that I really didn't need to go, that, Christmas and Easter were enough. Probably because he said I didn't need to go, I decided that I would go to church with my grandmother. I'm not going to say I had any kind of an intimate relationship with God at that point, but at least I knew he existed, and I did call upon him for help at times. I was more and more uncomfortable all the time and more fearful because I'd been so well manipulated, told, what harm I would do if I ever said anything. I was still afraid to say anything. About that time, my father went off on one of his little jaunts again. And shortly after he left, my mother told me that she was going to seek a legal separation. It was a great relief. Abused children, any form of abuse, your life is never perfect. Of course, nobody's life is perfect, but there are always residual issues along the way. My first husband had gone to Korea, and he had been home in October on leave, and everything was wonderful. Well, he came home in April, and he had fallen in love. So we had to be divorced. So that was a big wrinkle in my plan, something that I never expected. But thanks to Christian friends, by this time I was a Lutheran, and I had good friends who helped me through that time. And then God sent Ken into my life. He wasn't my type, but somehow we ended up married anyway. And not too long after these two very dissimilar people got married, God sent us to Guam. I am so grateful for that because we had no easy outs. We had to learn to get along. We were in Guam the first time for 2.5 years and then went back to Montgomery, Alabama. We only stayed there 18 months and we went back to Guam again. Both times we were on Guam, I worked for the Child Development Center on the Air Force Base, the second time in management. And so I got sent to a child abuse conference in Okinawa. Well, I had always avoided anything to do with child abuse. I didn't want to hear about it. I didn't want to see shows on it. I didn't want to read books on it. I just wanted nothing to do with it. And that way I could avoid thinking about what had happened as a child. Well, anyway, I had to go to the conference. I couldn't really tell them because at that time I told nobody I'd ever been abused. So I had to go to the conference, and I heard a lot of things that stuck with me. And one of the big things was they always recommended that any victim of any form of child abuse at some point confront their abuser. Well, I thought that can never happen. I have no idea where he is. I haven't seen him since I was 14, and I wasn't really sure that I wanted to. I was 39 Um, and I get a call from my mother. My father had been in contact. And in the course of the conversation, he asked my mother for our addresses, the kitties' addresses. So my mother said, "No, I will give them your address. And if they want to be in contact, they can." And I wrote to him because over the years, God had led me to know that I had to forgive him, not just for him, but for me. I know this was God's doing because my father had no good reason to do it. But before he wrote back to me, he wrote a letter to my mother admitting everything that had ever taken place. And she sent me that letter, and it was like having a weight drop. Just knowing that he admitted it made an enormous change in my life. All of a sudden, I was free from the guilt that abused children take on, whether it belongs to them or not. And it was so freeing. And I know that it was God's doing because my father had absolutely no reason. And he wasn't what you would call a selfless person. So I know that's where it came from. And I have been so grateful for that. I never did see my father again. He corresponded with me for just a few months, and then he stopped writing. And I learned in 1995 that he passed away. So thanks to the Lord, I had closure, and I am so grateful for that. He always brings good out of bad things.